feelings and expressing our feelings. We even have seen in recent interviews, say that famous Oprah Winfrey interview, that it's considered extremely important to give someone the space to express their feelings, and that those feelings are so valid that various different changes need to happen because of them, or policies need to happen because of them, or whatever the case may be. Not to comment on that in particular, but it struck me how contrasting that is with the ancient world's view of how we live and who we are, and many of the spiritual views that are put across by various sages and gurus throughout the ages, not the least of which pretty much all of the great philosophers in the past, who regularly indicated that it's our emotional nature, our feelings, which are essentially our downfall. That it is those feelings which often override the special intellectual and spiritual qualities that we attribute to our humanity and often get us into trouble. I've been reading an amazing author by the name of Neil Burton, who's really a philosopher and psychologist. He's written a large number of books, but one of his most famous books is really about emotional control and the control of desire. And he points out that many philosophers and many spiritual thinkers see desire as the root of all our behavior. We'll get into that in a moment. So tonight I wanted to talk about desire, how desire and emotion, lack of control of that, drives much of our lives, and how we can gain better control over that. As Neil Burton puts it, to control our emotions is to control ourselves, and to control ourselves is to control our destiny. But it's way easier said than done. The starting point is that there is always desire. Desires are constantly coming up. I want this, I want that, I want that. From the most ordinary things of life to the most luxurious things of life to the most basic things of life, everything is really driven by desires. It is like a constant flow between us. And quite frankly, if we didn't have that constant flow of desire, there really wouldn't be anything else to do. It's like life would stop. We see that in cases where people suffering from depression or other emotional crises lose the ability to desire things, and life pretty much stops. So when we look at it that way, it would seem that desire is a necessary function of being a human being, and even a desirable function, because it seems like in order to actually achieve anything in the world, we need desire. Even goals, ambitions are really all based around desire. There's a desire for an outcome, there's a desire for achieving the goal, there's a desire for the rewards that the goals produce, and we would have to agree that those desires are necessary to allow us to function successfully in the world. So how could desire be a problem? Desire is essentially the ultimate motivator. When we want something, our sense of wanting it is kind of stimulated by contemplation of what happens when we get it, the satisfaction we will have, or the enjoying the result, or whatever it is that we desired. Once we get it, we have projected ourselves already into that situation, and we foresee ourselves enjoying it and benefiting from it and so on. And so that's how it acts as a motivator. And most ancient philosophers say that the fundamental motivator of all human action is desire. Desire not only motivates us, but it gives us our direction, and it gives meaning to that direction. Not deep and meaningful kind of meaning as in the meaning of life, but it gives meaning within the practical details of our own life. And it is that desire that is exploited in the world of marketing and advertising, especially in the world today, where we've got highly sophisticated artificial intelligence which is able to capitalize on your desire. Advertising companies have put millions of dollars into research as to what drives desire, what stimulates desire, and essentially finding ways to induce us to want things. Advertisers famously make us want what we didn't know that we wanted. And so they exploit the fact that desire is the ultimate motivator, and as we shall see, they exploit the fact that we're not as in touch with our desires as it sounds. Yes, it's true that desire motivates much of our ambition, but as we shall see, it's also true that a lot of desire is kind of below consciousness in some way, and a lot of that motivation is not as known to us. Our desires are not as known to us, and so it is that is manipulated and controlled. And especially, as I said, in the world of targeted advertising where we find ourselves today, where your desires are tracked and further analyzed to uncover desires that you may well have but that you didn't know that you have, all to the end goal of selling you a product. That is the desire of the advertiser, is to sell you the product. The interesting thing that might have occurred to you right from the start is that if desire is driving a lot of our behavior, and it's so fundamental to everything we do, why would we want to stop it? I mean, if it is literally the motivator of life, if it is life, as many ancient philosophies say, desire is life, why would we want to control desire? I mean, if think about even trying to control desire, even wanting to control desire is a desire. So is it even possible to escape the fact that desire is the motivating force, even at the most unconscious of levels? Well, one of the most important characteristics of ourselves as human beings is that we try and create a better life for ourselves, or maybe a more pleasant or less painful life for ourselves. In common with all the creatures on the earth, we experience life as very painful and as random and chaotic. And clearly a major characteristic of our species is to attempt to control that. We control nature and we control things in order to feel safer, in order to protect ourselves from disease and attack, in order to experience pleasant things, all sorts of reasons. We've controlled the world perhaps too far, as we know. We've ended up destroying half of the world because of our very strong need to control. But that control is kind of an evolutionary principle in us that makes us want to feel better, safer, and in less pain, a very important motivator for us. So we seek to control life, or our own lives. And if we seek to control life, then we need to control desire, because desire sounds great when you say it's the major motivator and it gets us to the goal, and without it life would be meaningless. The fact remains that with it, it is capable of being one of the most incredibly destructive forces that there is. Think of sexual desire, which the great philosophers and spiritual thinkers have frequently identified as one of the most powerful desires, and I think we all know that. So you could have a desire for a job, a desire to achieve a certain goal, a desire for a family with a home and a safe emotional environment, and you could expend an enormous amount of time and energy, years in your life, pursuing those desires and gradually more and more fulfilling that desire as you create a safe space for yourself and your family. But someone comes along that excites you sexually, you experience sexual desire, and that drive is capable of tipping over everything else. It's not only the sexual desires, greed, the epitome of maximum desire, does that too. But the sexual desire example is a great and important example of how desire can actually upend our lives completely. We can become obsessed with achieving it, and we can become embittered when we don't. Plato says that individual desires interfere with us achieving our ideals. In fact, even interfere with some greater ideal for the species or for your social group being achieved. As the philosophers have said, it is one of the greatest causes of woe for mankind, because it pulls us off our path. It pulls us away from our intellect. In that example of sexual desire, despite the fact that we might know intellectually and logically why it is necessary to pursue our current path, how the desire, the sexual desire that is pulling us in that direction can upend everything. We can know that intellectually, and yet most times, if we're not in control of desire, the desire wins out and ends up upending our lives completely. So it is a real and serious issue, the need to actually control desire. You know, in the Hindu tradition, desire is actually the motivating force for creation. It is the origin point in the creative myth, in the creation myth, in the Rig Veda, 7,000-year-old poem, which contains that creation myth, starts off by saying, in the beginning there was the desire that was the first seed of mind. And it goes on to explain how that desire would eventually become the life force that is also the great symbol of sin, the destroyer of knowledge, and the destroyer of self-realization. We cannot know ourselves if we allow our desires to drive us. And yet, in that Hindu culture, desire is described as the most primal force that there is. It is, in other language, perhaps in an older style of language, we might say it's part of our animal nature that seems to be something that is beyond the control of the intellectual nature. It is what was used to describe the difference between ourselves as animals and ourselves as thinking creatures. Similarly, in Buddhism, in the Four Noble Truths, the second noble truth essentially says that desire, coveting or craving, is the cause of all suffering. Desire is the cause of all suffering, and all suffering can be framed in terms of desire. So Burton points out that when desires that are not fulfilled create pain, it becomes fear and anxiety about the future. And that's because our desires for what we want in the future are not being met. We also experience sadness when we think about things that went wrong in the past, desires that weren't fulfilled, things that didn't happen. I mean, according to him, the midlife crisis is a crisis of desire. He says, at the time of our midlife crisis, the middle-aged person begins to realize that their reality does not live up to their dreams and desires of their youth. The crisis occurs because the person thinks, who am I? How did I get here? This isn't what I wanted. I wanted X, Y, or Z. That never happened. And so they have a crisis of identity and a crisis of meaning in their lives. So it is that disparity between desire and actuality that is causing so much pain and grief, and that leads to that major crisis. That hopefully in the case of the midlife crisis leads to a shift and a realignment of one's identity, and hopefully with more appropriate and realistic desires. There's also the problem of greed, which is also a problem that arises out of desire. Greed is like insatiable desire. And just like lust, greed in the end prevents us from enjoying the fruits of our desire, because we always seem to want more. and we want more of this, we want more, we want something to be better than that, more and better. And I mean, we've probably got more than human beings ever dreamed of having in previous era, in previous generations, and so on. But greed blinds us, and it just makes us think that we deserve more. And that gets back to what I was saying at the beginning about feelings, that we believe that we have rights and entitlements related to our feelings, related to our desires. And those rights and entitlements related to our desires can pull us right off our tracks. And it is an interesting way to analyze the issues that have arisen in that British royal family in relation to the interview, which was all about people's feelings and desires, as opposed to the controlled reality that they found themselves in. Of course, what is clear from this is that desire is connected to pleasure as well as pain. So when we achieve our desires, or we feel the feeling of pleasure, in fact, the pursuit of something we want even produces that. But interestingly, the desire probably evolved because we kind of have an inbuilt drive to pursue the things that will help us survive and will help us reproduce, and avoid the things that produce pain. So things like sex and luxurious foods and things like that tend to create pleasure and tend to excite our desire. But that feeling of being contented and satisfied when you eat the sugar, when you have the sex, doesn't favor our evolutionary desire to survive, because we need to keep on moving forward and feeling the need to achieve the next thing. So that means the sense of satisfaction in fulfillment of desire is contrary to evolution. Evolution, remember, is trying to drive us to protect and grow the species. It doesn't allow us to feel complacent and says, okay, you've done that, and evolution stops. It just doesn't work like that. So the evolution of desire tells us that desire is designed to be unfulfillable. And if that's about creating more safety and essential things like that, it probably isn't a problem. But if it's around sex, sugar, or things which create pain in our lives, then all it does is produce more pain. Desire evolved to promote survival. It didn't evolve to make us feel more happy, to make us feel more fulfilled, to make us feel wealthier than the next person, or even to make us feel any sense of meaning and purpose, which are not really evolutionary outcomes. The feeling of meaning and purpose, again, is an end product, and evolution does not drive us towards an end product. It's got to keep on driving us forward. Now we live in a state where survival isn't the most critical thing anymore. We don't have too much of an issue of surviving as a species or reproducing as a species. We've kind of done a little bit too much of that. We've got too many people and too few resources, and reproduction seems ridiculous. And yet we still have these desires that drive us, both at that basic level to survive and reproduce, but also to create more, and the greed and desire that drives what has become the destruction of the environment, the destruction, overuse of resources of the planet, as well as exploding population, all describe unchecked desire, indeed uncheckable desire. It may be true that part of our specialness as humans is our intellect, and our intellect can tell us don't pursue the desire so much. It also evolved to help us pursue survival. Its purpose is not to help us resist our desires or transcend those desires. In fact, the intellect has been captured by the desires, and we justify and build our motivations and our justifications into our desires instead of allowing the intellect to dominate the desires. And as I said at the beginning, it's because a lot of desire is actually unconscious. They compete with each other, and psychologists tell us that the desire that prevails is the one that is at the limit of our understanding. The great 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer says, "We often don't know what we desire or fear. For years we can have a desire without admitting it to ourselves or even letting it come to consciousness, because the intellect is not to know anything about it, since the good opinion of ourselves which we have would inevitably suffer if we knew our desires. But if the wish is fulfilled, we get to know from our joy, not without shame, that this is what we desired." So he paints this picture of desire as kind of separate from the intellect, which sounds even a little bit scared and shamed by it. And yet we pursue it because the intellect doesn't know until it's too late that the desire is either shameful or upends our life in some undesirable fashion. You know, desires are generally divided into natural and unnatural desires. Natural desires are the ones like seeking protection, food, shelter, and so on. Unnatural desires are things like fame or power or wealth. And the difference is that unnatural desires are unlimited. I mean, do you have enough fame, power, or wealth? Is there such a thing for those people who desire that? Natural desires you can easily achieve. I can get the food, I can get the shelter. Unnatural desires are never satisfied. The ancient philosopher Epicurus said that desires that are natural are easy to satisfy and pleasurable to satisfy, like food, whereas desires that are unnatural are neither easy nor pleasurable to satisfy, and therefore more difficult to eliminate, and yet those are the ones that need to be eliminated. He said, identify your unnatural desires, because they are the ones that you cannot fulfill. If we learn to see the difference and eliminate those, we will minimize or eliminate the pain and anxiety of having these unfulfilled or unfulfillable desires and reach a state of greater tranquility, says Epicurus. He says, if you want to make a man happy, add not to his riches, but rather take away from his desires. Unnatural desires are desires that are socially determined. They're not really things that are innate to our human nature, but socially determined means things like fame and power, wealth, reflect in the eyes of our society. And socially determined desires are often destructive in some way. They create envy. They create the need or desire to see others lose or fail, succeed less than ourselves, because they create competition. So by overcoming the desires to please, the desire to impress, the desire to surpass others in some way, and learning to live for ourselves, we begin to free ourselves from unnatural and destructive desires. Only then, only by mastering our desires, by identifying what is a core natural desire, but is the desire that I'm feeling for that an unnatural desire? Only by freeing ourselves from the unnatural desires will we be able to live life to the fullest and get a sense of peace of mind and peace of life. Desire itself is not the problem. It is desire run amok. And that is what unnatural desire is. Remember, You can identify a natural desire because it's competitive, it can make other people unhappy, it puts us in a position of needing to be better or more victorious than another person, and is generally unfulfillable. So who wants it anyway? Focus on the core desires to have food, have shelter, have peace and harmony and equanimity and equality with those around you. Constantly test yourself on that one and try and free yourself from as much desire as possible, because it is freeing yourself from desire that is the ultimate spiritual goal that the masters tell us to pursue. Learning not to say I want is a great place to start. I'll be back next week at the usual time. See you then.